So good afternoon, my name is Kevin. I'm a member of the Green Business Club at Columbia Business School. I'm honored to invite our keynote speakers for the next panel, Ken Caldeira, Senior Scientist at Gates Ventures, and Professor Gernot Wagner to the stage to lead a discussion on bridging finance, policy, and technology, catalyzing climate action to overcome the green premium. Gernot, I will now pass it on to you. Folks, make sure you submit questions through the QR code throughout the session, and then we'll have a bit of time at the end for Q&A. All right, so without further ado, let's give them a hand.
Thanks, Kevin. Great to be here. I can tell you this is a continuation of a 2-day-long conversation we've been having on lots and lots of different topics. Here, we will zero in on the money, the capital. And of course, senior advisor, Gates whisperer, to sort of the whole slew of Bill Gates' climate-focused efforts. I guess, can you tell us a bit of the history? Can we start with this, right? So you're a climate scientist, stellar career as an academic, first at Carnegie Science, and now still as a scientist, but basically within breakthrough energy, pointing to what works, stamping out the nonsense, trying to guide somebody who we all know or have heard of, who plays an enormous role in this climate energy world into the right direction. How did you end up with this job?
In 2007, I got a phone call from the guy who led the development of Excel spreadsheets, Jay Blumenthal. And he said, that they want to start a series of learning sessions for Bill Gates on climate science. And so he asked me and David Keith, and then there was another Microsoft early employee that helped organize these. And my sense was that Bill, up to that time, had been focused on global health issues, vaccines, development issues, and hadn't really addressed climate change as a problem. And so he wanted to get informed about it. And so for the first year or so, we did a bunch of 4-hour compressed sort of graduates course, compressed into 4 hours kind of sessions. And I think the first year we did 4 of those on climate change, and then maybe 2 early the next year. And then he was kind of okay, I get it. This is a real thing. And he very quickly shifted his attention to solutions and how do we address this problem. And he very quickly came to the idea, that energy technologies are going to be key. And so then that was out of the domain where I knew anything. And so, he'd want to learn about batteries, or he'd want to learn about cement, or he'd want to learn about hydrogen. And so we'd say, who are the best 3 people in the world on cement? And then let's see if we can get them in. And most people say yes. And by the way, the only people who said no are economists. Tom Schelling said no, and Nordhaus said no, but everybody else showed up. But anyway, I don't know what
they both do hold the Nobel Prize in economics.
There's some status there. So anyway,
say Bill, come to us if.
I think they might have done. Well, if you come to me, I
have some office hours.
Right. Yeah. So anyway,
not all economists are quite that arrogant.
But anyway, that gives you an indication of the quality of people we were trying to bring in to meet with Bill. But so then I went through a parallel education because let's say we have 3 people on making hydrogen, and so we'd have to develop a reading list and a syllabus, and Bill would typically read a few hundred pages of papers, scientific, technical stuff before one of these sessions. And then in the session, my role was generally to be the kind of idiot. And so that, because the expert would say something with all kinds of...
The Corchester.
But the expert would say something with lots of jargon, And I would sort of kind of repeat it, like what I understood was this, and I would say it again using ordinary English. And I said, did I get that right? And I think by me being the idiot, it saved Bill from having to be the idiot. Not that Bill would be an idiot, and then, I guess after, in 2000, they offered me a position to say, hey, why don't you come up here and do this? And so my role is to try to bring good...
In 2020, right?
2020, yeah. So my role is to bring in good scientific information into the organization. And, you called me an advisor, and I really don't give any advice, because my assumption is that these are smart people, and Bill's especially smart, and with good judgment, and if he's provided with good information, he can decide what to do. And
so you don't tell him what to think, you give him the facts.
Yeah, every once in a while I would say, well, if it were me, I might consider doing this, but I don't ever say you should do this. I would be afraid to do that.
Okay, so what is Gates Ventures doing?
So Gates Ventures is Bill's personal office. And it acts like the umbrella organization that then so money that goes to breakthrough energy or goes to the foundation flows out of Gates Ventures. So it's the umbrella sort of parent organization to a whole constellation of different companies and organizations that...
Some are for profit, some are philanthropic.
Yeah, and there's a whole network, and and even breakthrough energy itself is a few separate things. Things are complicated up there. So there's a for-profit piece of it, Breakthrough Energy Ventures, and a non-profit Breakthrough Energy, and then there's also a advanced technology skunk works called Orca Sciences, and then he's got his nuclear power company and this and that. So there's a whole, and I just try to support all of these.
Okay, so you have $40 billion spread over these lots of different ventures. How do you think about allocating priorities? Like, there's sort of the obvious, right? There's, nuclear, fine, that's one, right? And, skunk works, sort of Orca, that's the far off stuff. But I guess especially philanthropy on the one hand versus, patient capital for profit.
Yeah. Now, if you talk to your average economist, they'll tell you there's a marginal...
Happy to be the stand-in here.
That there's a marginal return on investment in each domain, and you want to invest across the entire portfolio such that you get the same return on the marginal dollar in all of them.
Sure.
The problem is, if you're doing clean energy R&D, you have no idea if I fund this research project, what's the probability distribution of what level of success? And so doing some kind of formal portfolio analysis ends up being really tough.
Wouldn't stop an economist to still open a spreadsheet, right, and try, but that's not what's happening.
So I think there's a couple of things. One is there are some things that are super obviously underfunded.
For example?
You can disagree, and I'm not going to necessarily defend the specific portfolio, but what Bill did is look at what kinds of things was ARPA-E funding, and kind of said, well, I'm not going to fund that. And so then some of the things that weren't being funded are things like direct air capture or some of the hydrogen things, aviation fuels, that now have some more funding, but
sort of pre-Inflation Reduction Act, there was very little in that.
Right, and so the other, so I think the first thing was just what's obviously underfunded and put money into that, and then you can look at what's the scale of funding needed to make some real difference in that area. The other thing is that there is just some decisions of scope that Bill's picked out, like 5 areas that we're going to work in, and even if something's good, if it's out of scope, it's just out of scope. And I think that's you could have because I mean, especially with Bill, there's other issues like you could fund vaccines or you could fund clean energy development, and their malaria program, they estimate they work in quality adjusted life years and not lives saved, but they estimated that for every $800 invested, they saved somebody's life. And so you have to think, okay, well, I'm doing clean energy investment. That's a tough metric. Can you make sure that your $800 going into clean energy gives you that level of return? And so Bill is super focused on return on investment. I think when you're not limited regarding scale, the question is, what is the return as a function of scale, and then at what scale do I maximize return on investment? And
can you give us some examples? And by the way, so don't be distracted by the camera behind me. Just no pressure for the questions later, but whether or not this documentary wins an Emmy or not may or may not depend on the quality of questions asked. So, but back to sort of examples, right? Is there like a specific company that you would say that's the most exciting thing out there in a particular category?
So, two things. One is I'm not involved in enterprise level evaluation, and maybe now it's a good time to talk about what the structure of this whole breakthrough energy is and how these kind of decisions get made. Because I'm on the scientific input side of things, and I'll be evaluating whether the concepts that a company is proposing makes basic thermodynamic and chemical sense, but I'm not going to be evaluating the business model for the company or anything like that. It's other people. So, so Breakthrough Energy has different programs, and I should say that the key thing that happens outside of Breakthrough Energy, and that's idea generation. And that can happen either within just individuals or within universities, but often they are, some professor with their graduate students or graduate students has an idea for a company. And, so maybe they incorporate. And there's some discussion making an earlier stage thing, but right now the earliest thing works more or less with the canonical thing is a professor and two graduate students form a company. But they don't know how to raise capital. They don't know how to run businesses, really. They know how to study some chemistry or physics or something. And so there's a program called the Fellows Program, and they'll, typically for a year, maybe 2 years, give, something like $1 million, $2 million, just as grant money. So it's just philanthropic. And they pair the technical expert, the person with the idea generation with a business, what they call a business fellow. So there'll be, sort of the chief technical officer and the CEO kind of. And they do a pretty good job on vetting. And so originally this was a 2-year program. But what was happening was that the VC community looked at the vetting of the fellows as a pretty good indicator of whether they're worth investing in. And so most of them were getting investment in the first year and didn't need the second year. So that's out of a 501c3 Breakthrough Energy. So the next step is Breakthrough Energy Ventures, and that's a for-profit. And Eric Toon, who was in leadership at RPE, is leading that in terms of making investment decisions. And they're getting pension funds and other things, VCs, but not just VCs, to invest in these early stage companies. And the idea of this is to kind of take, something that kind of left the Fellows Program and scale it up to something that can be commercially successful. And, there's been some, initially, I think there was some idea, we just want to invest in crazy things. And I spoke with Vinod Khosla once, and he was complaining, that the fund's not being adventurous enough. And he says, if I want to make money, I can invest it in my own fund. I put money into Breakthrough Energy, because I want to lose it, is kind of what he said. Right? But the leadership of Breakthrough Energy says, no, that's not right, because we want to attract capital into clean energy development and commercialization. And so the way you attract capital is by showing that you can make money. And so Breakthrough Energy Ventures is just a pure for-profit clean energy investment fund. Then on the other side of that, there's something called the Catalyst program. And that's, again, a nonprofit. And this one, like one example is Rondo Energy. They just handed them $75 million, a grant to a for-profit commercial company. And the idea is, and we did a paper on this some years ago, that if you think that things go down learning curves or experience curves, there are some technologies where if they go down their experience curve, they'll be able to compete in the marketplace, but today they're too expensive. And there's something called a learning subsidy that you need to subsidize the production of this thing until it can be cost competitive on its own. And so Bill's been basically granting big chunks of money to for-profit companies, not taking any equity. I mean, a lot of these companies he has some equity position in also, but it's still, he could have demanded stock for it, but doesn't, and just gives it as a gift. And anyway, so that's the third piece there.
Okay, so actually that's sort of an interesting part, right? So the standard view is, in many ways, there are these far-out technologies. That's where the research, the R, comes in. Sometimes the D in R&D, development. Very different from deployment. Very different from, right, R, D, and D, and there's a bunch of more Ds, diffusion, demonstration, and so on. But let's stick with the first couple. So research, development, deployment. Research and development are sort of the, new tech, green hydrogen, fusion, far-off technologies. Deployment is the stuff we know, the stuff that's actually possibly already cheap enough and ought to compete, but there's still some barriers here, and it takes a lot of money, presumably, for the CapEx, for the initial investment, and then you get out of the way. What you just described is all on the research and development side.
Well, I think they would say we're on the commercialization side of things. That, in fact, I would say that in some ways, breakthrough energy is a misnomer because the breakthrough usually comes before.
Has happened before
that, and because they're about taking a company that just formed and helping scale it up and be commercially successful. And so there really isn't. There's no like research funding, and there's no, it's all about commercialization.
Yeah. So it's scale and speed. Yeah. To exactly. Paraphrase the book title of a VC who gave the money to the wrong university. But but actually that's the point, right? So John Doerr, Kleiner Perkins, is the sort of VC firm that clearly would never give a grant, as far as I know, right, to any entity, commercial or otherwise. Right. Bill Gates does, which does make this venture somewhat unique, right? So yes, the breakthrough has happened, but the breakthrough might have happened in the lab, and now you give that prof and the grad student money to go out into the real world. That's a very early stage. Yeah.
By the way, John Doerr of Kleiner Perkins, they were involved in clean energy funding, I don't know what, 15 years ago or something like this.
Sort of the first cycle,
and,
the first time around.
And they lost a lot of money at it. And I had the privilege of sitting in a meeting with Bill Gates and John Doerr where they were talking about lessons learned. And Doerr was kind of saying, like, I'm never going to invest in this stuff again, kind of. And one of the things that they were saying, or Doerr was saying, is that when they invest in something like Google, you have a team of bright young people who are motivated to do all kinds of things. And if they fail at what they're doing, this bright young team can pivot and figure out some other idea. And so Google, they didn't know how they were going to monetize this in the beginning, but they had an idea for a search engine, and then we'll figure out how to make money later. And that was obviously super successful. But if you have to build a steel plant or a cement plant or something like this is huge infrastructure, and a group of programmers you can give $1 million to, but if you want to build some pilot plant for something, you might be talking 100 million or more. And then you have this piece of hardware that you can't pivot to do something else. And the other thing is that in the software industry, once you make Microsoft Excel, making another unit of Microsoft Excel costs almost nothing, and you get all this revenue. But if you're trying to sell electrons in a wire where people already get it cheaply from natural gas, now you have a high capital cost. You're competing into a mature market with low margins, and this high marginal cost of each unit of production. And so
there's a big difference, right? Technology growing into a void, basically,
yeah.
Right? Versus, there is steel out there. It's produced using coal. It's causing more CO2 emissions than 2+ tons of CO2 for each ton of steel. But frankly, the consumer doesn't know the difference, right? Between the steel versus the green steel.
And 20 years ago, people thought, maybe cap and trade was on the horizon, or a carbon tax. And so there was a lot of interest in the fossil fuel companies in carbon capture and storage, because there was the expectation that these price drivers would be coming down the road, whereas now there's less confidence that there will ever be a disincentive, or anytime soon be major disincentives on CO2 emission. And so, so that makes things tougher. One thing, what you really want to do, so Bill has this concept of green premium. And the green premium, as he describes it, is the difference in cost between a technology that emits a greenhouse gas, like carbon dioxide, and something that provides the same services without emitting the greenhouse gas. And so that typically costs more, although not always, and that additional cost is the green premium. And so if you don't have a price driver, you really want that green premium to be zero, or preferably even negative, so that the clean technology is cheaper than the CO2.
So for solar PV, it's negative, right? Solar is cheaper than any other form of electricity generation.
Yes. When you have, there was a study, I think in 2015, by the National Renewable Energies Lab, and there's been other studies since then, that showed that if you just built a lot of wind and solar, but still had our existing fossil fuel infrastructure in the background, that you could substitute the wind and solar energy for all of this natural gas and coal and spend less money and reduce emissions by 80%.
Win-win-win.
Right. And so when solar and wind are used to replace or substitute for fossil fuels, then there's cost savings. And so we're already, have a negative green premium there. And so the challenges now are the last 20% of the electricity sector, when you can't rely on fossil fuels to provide reliability. And then the other hard to decarbonize sectors like steel and cement and heavy duty transportation and air travel and shipping and agriculture.
And and Bill is invested on the one hand in every one of these elements, right?
Yeah.
So last 20% of the electricity sector is nuclear, potentially, is batteries. What else can possibly do this?
Well, one is fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage, then direct air capture of the residual CO2 that comes out would be another one.
And so it's that on the one hand, right? And then Climeworks on the other, direct air capture company. So Bill Gates famously offsets his own emissions, spending $1,200 per ton of CO2.
Yeah, some crazy amount like that.
Some crazy number, okay.
But people were selling forest offsets for like $15.
And he was spending $1,200.
And because he wanted something that was real.
Okay. And he can afford it, turns out.
Yeah. But also, it turns out...
And he has a 767 idling in his driveway,
yeah,
right?
no,
So
but it turns out that if you're an airline and your plane is in the air 95% of the time, then fuel costs is dominant, and it's a major piece of the overall cost picture. If you happen to be a billionaire where you have a plane that sits on the tarmac over 95% of the time, then it turns out the fuel cost is like 10% of the overall cost, and so that.
So he's doing it better than That's better for having a private jet is better.
No. What he's saying,
okay,
but I think what Bill would say, I shouldn't quote him, but I think he thinks that everyone with a private plane should be offsetting their
should be fully offsetting their
emissions because it would add like 10% to the cost of their flying.
Fair. Okay. We have lots of questions. Sort of on the policy, on the specifics, and so on that we can get into. But actually, let me just see that how many questions do we have from the audience? Anything Emmy Award-winning to ask? We can start. So yeah, why don't we do that? And can always turn back. But Kevin, go ahead.
Ken, are there any areas or projects that you're particularly excited about that Gates Ventures is looking at, and kind of related? Any opinion on nature-based solutions as a general area?
Okay, that's a trigger word for me.
Sorry. Next question.
Let me just say something about nature-based. To me,
look, this is real, right?
To me, physics and chemistry, aluminum is nature. That to me, I think everything that works is nature-based because it's based on physics and chemistry and thermodynamics, and that's what nature is. So
let me help you out. Like $15 on a forest carbon offset. Yes, no?
I prefer permanence myself, but
So better than nothing or worse than nothing?
Yeah. So I would say when.
Good, right?
Yeah, to me, one of
This
the reasons. Good. Yeah, to me, one of the reasons to avoid climate change is to protect ecosystems, and so I think where ecosystem protection provides co-benefits in terms of climate and so on, that's all great. If you want to chop down a forest to create some pine monoculture to feed some biomass plant, then I'm probably not so thrilled about it.
You're saying offsets lead us in that direction potentially, unless there is some safeguards.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole issue of this ecosystem services idea, and that, and where the ecosystem services say to preserve the ecosystem, and it's fine, but you could also come up with the result that you should liquidate the ecosystem because you could get more wood value than the services. And so I put a higher value. I would just value natural ecosystems more than the average person.
Then carbon forest offsets would pay for. Then the market is for carbon forest offsets would be willing to pay for.
Right.
Okay. Can't we take it personal? Go. Kevin.
We'll do moderate first. So on the flip side to that, are there any particular areas that you are really excited about that Gates Ventures that have a focus on?
Yeah, so I mean I guess I tend to like the oddball things that probably aren't going to work just because they're more fun to think about. But one project that I'm more heavily involved in. Basically, first of all, let me just start off by saying I'm just in favor of anything that works, and I don't really care. I'm not so much a partisan for this technology or against that technology. If you can get something to work and be cheap, I'm happy.
Work meaning?
Yeah, that it provides its services, and it doesn't have harmful environmental consequences, and it's cheap. Then I'm happy with it. So I don't really pick favorites too much. The one project I'm working on now that Breakthrough Energy's created a unit for is changing aircraft flight patterns to avoid the formation of contrail-induced cirrus clouds. And the EPA estimates that social cost of carbon is around $190 a ton CO2. It's thought for like $1 to $2 per ton CO2 equivalent, you could get an equivalent amount of cooling just by shifting air flights a little bit. So that's one project. We're looking at this various things like borehole or underground thermal energy storage of just like resistively heating the solid earth or to store electricity. But there's a bunch of things, but none of which may or may not be commercial. I'm really not a fan of different things.
Got it. And then, as we think about the efficiency side of the equation, right, and so things that maybe aren't on the bleeding edge of technology, how does Gates Ventures and yourself think about that? Any areas in particular?
What do you think about boring technology?
Yeah. I don't know. But, efficiency, right. Efficiency is an important piece. If you can do the same, one of the reasons electric cars are nicer than gasoline-powered cars is more of the energy goes into, providing the service directly instead of just heating the environment. And, and obviously the LEDs and all these other efficiency improvements help reduce emissions, but of course efficiency can never get us to zero emissions. And so I think efficiency improvements are essential, but not sufficient. Necessary, but not sufficient.
Got it. I think another area in climate investment that maybe there's a little bit of opaqueness in is deal structure, deal valuation, kind of the amount of investment that goes in, and how does Gates Ventures think about the information sharing and like market signaling in that environment through the projects you all are involved in? Yeah,
I'm probably not the person to speak to this one. The investment side is really through Breakthrough Energy Ventures, and that would be a different team. I'm more on these science evaluations.
To be clear, there's sort of there's the name effect, right? There is, Bill invests in Electra, and the headline actually says Bill Gates funded startups does.
Yeah, first of all, they have pretty good vetting, but at different, each of these three things that I said, the fellows, the ventures, and the catalyst, there's some pretty serious vetting going on at each of these stages. And so there are a bunch of investors, like if Breakthrough Energy Ventures invests in something, they'll follow along and just assume that they can trust the vetting that Breakthrough Energy Ventures did. And that's usually, but not always, a good assumption.
Yeah. You talked about this a little bit earlier, but, in some of the dynamics working with Bill Gates. But what is, when you disagree on a course of action, maybe how does those conversations go, or what's that relationship like?
If we disagree, then what he wants happens.
Sure. Yeah.
No, my role is information provision.
Have you told him where he was wrong at some point, and he has changed his?
Yeah.
Yes. Right.
Yeah, no, I see one of my key roles actually is to try to bring information that conflicts with his priors. One example is, he very reasonably favors energy systems that have high spatial density or energy density, and which leads him to things like nuclear power and so on. And he was somewhat initially dismissive of wind and solar, and we brought in people from National Renewable Energy Lab to describe their study about how you could get 80% emissions reduction in the electricity sector at zero cost. And then also Chris Clack did a similar study, and we brought them. And once Bill saw, this modeling work that showed that as long as you have the fossil fuel backup to provide system reliability, that there was all this cost saving through fuel substitution, that then he, became, positive, changed his mind about wind and solar and became positive about it. And so that, so I think he's very information driven and is ready to shed his priors in the face of new information.
Got it. How have you all thought about, geographic split in terms of, are there areas of the world where it feels like there needs to be more investment? How does Gates Ventures think about its role there?
Yeah, so again, I can't speak on behalf of Bill, but my general impression is that the thought is that the rich countries are where the technology development needs to happen, that the technologies can be created here and costs driven down, and then when, as the global south becomes wealthier and the technologies become cheaper, then they could be adopted later there. But that, for people whose primary threat is, things like food, shelter, jobs, to expect climate change to be at the top of their agenda is a little unrealistic.
But may I just probe a little bit? So,
Sure.
I mean, sure, the original invention might have happened here in our national labs. China is the one that has climbed the learning curve, slid down the cost curve, and frankly subsidized the development and the learning by doing, right? So in many ways, it's right, their electric cars, the solar panels, and so on. So in some sense, right, it goes the other way. Yeah,
well, I think, if you divide the world, the people of the world into 5 groups, China has about 20% of the people, and they're in that, that 60 to 80 percentile in terms of richest people in the world. India also has about 20% of the people in the world, and they're in this sort of 20 to 40. So there's 20% of the countries have a per capita GDP above China's, 20% between China and India, 20% below India. And, and so I think, most of Bill's Global South kind of work is focused on that 20% that's below India, but of course many people in India are in that category also. And I forget where the question was going, but so I think the idea that obviously China is maybe, one of the places where technologies are being developed and improved, but I think they're still in the top half of the world in terms of per capita GDP.
Probably time for one more question, but as you think about where innovation is being driven, do you feel that comes from places that are government supported, research institutions, private industry, or what's your view on that?
So, I think a key. Actually, once heard a talk from Bill Gates's father, and he was saying, look, my son wouldn't have become a billionaire unless, there were roads and highways and a rule of law and schools and things, one thing I'm fearful of right now is, we just need the rule of law and we need good educational system, because I think the ideas come out of people who have an education, and then the ability to commercialize these ideas depend on, working in an economic system and a legal system that protects companies. I have friends who created a company in Moscow, and when it gets to a certain size, somebody comes and threatens to break your legs unless you give, or worse, unless you give them half the company. And if you're trying to create a business in that environment, it's not very good. And so, I think just having the basic rule of law, legal system, good education is key. And I would say not all of the good ideas come out of universities, but they almost all come out of people who have a good education, because you need some physics or chemistry or some kind of ability to think and communicate. And so, I think the seed corn for innovation is just, rule of law, this civil infrastructure, and education.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause to Professor Wagner and Ken.